정신이 나간 자냐.貴様を粉々にし俺に勝てるはずは。
It's rare that an action game comes out that gets so under my skin, but Furi is one of those games. I've had to come back to this intro a couple of days after recording the full review because I went back and realised that I just wasn't being coherent because I still had adrenaline pumping through my veins from playing the game. So I'm going to try and convince you now in this review as to why I think Furi is one of the best games I've played this year and why it's absolutely deserving of your money. Now, Furi is a game all about boss fights, and I believe, as I'm sure many of you do, that bosses in video games are a somewhat contentious feature. To some, they represent the worst of design philosophy. Their needless padding, difficulty spikes, a deviation from the game's set rules and rhythms just to clumsily emphasise a plot point or a narrative beat. They often take the form of, this enemy is important because unlike the other 30 guys you just shot to death, this one is going to take 100 more bullets. For absolutely no reason. He's just a guy in body armour, why can't I just headshot him? Come on, you've seen bosses like this and they're terrible. However, to other people and to other designers, they're opportunities to present crescendos of creativity. They're a chance for the game to experiment with its rule set, an opportunity to turn up the pressure and test the wit and reflexes of its players. Regardless of where you fall on the spectrum of loving bosses or hating bosses, I'm going to try and convince you in this video to give Furi a chance because I think it's a really, really special game that has a lot of clever ideas. Now, I'm willing to bet the first thing people notice about Furi is its visual design, its very striking aesthetic. This carries on in the game into its music as well, and I thought I'd talk about this first because it's one of the minor points of the game that I wasn't massively impressed by. I think the soundtrack is very good, it's from some interesting artists. However, it's not really my bag. That's not to say that the music doesn't fit the tone of the game really well, because it does. It's just not really my thing, and I found myself turning it down a little bit because it is that kind of droning, repetitive music, and I just wish it was a little more vital at times, perhaps like the health soundtrack from Max Payne 3 or the really, really excellent music from Hotline Miami. The visual design, however, is much more memorable. It brings to mind the stylings of perhaps Hyperlight Drifter or Hotline Miami or maybe even the Neon Demon, Nicholas Winding Refn's latest film. And all of the characters are designed by Afro Samurai creator Takashi Okazaki, so you're going to end up facing this weird cohort of fiendish foes that are all kind of weird, wacky deviations from what you may consider regular boss designs in other games. Now, in terms of what it actually is, Furi is a game that trades in speed and precision. It's a strange chimera of a game, stitching parts of other games together to create something that manages to be both kind of prescriptive in its interpretation of how these mechanics should work and should be applied in a combat scenario, but also broad enough to surprise you with its varied fights and little tiny tweaks on mechanics that you might think are kind of stale. Fights are initially perhaps deceptively simple. They take place over a number of telegraph phases, with most of these phases resulting in a close combat encounter that signals your transition over to the next phase. On this transition, we have our first interesting twist of the mechanics. When you transition, the boss permanently loses a health bar and you get to refill yours, and depending on how well you've done in the fight, you might even get another health bar back as well. Simply, what this does is it creates a kind of tug-of-war situation where instant KOs are impossible, but also as a result there's a kind of unexpected roughness to your progress. Fights can be hard to win without repetition, as bosses are unpredictable, and phases can be protracted out to uncomfortable lengths if you don't pass the required responses you need to make quick enough. However, despite these misgivings, I think it's an incredibly engaging combat game, and it brings to mind the boss hunter fights in Bloodborne, or the Jean Nello Angelo fights in Bayonetta or Devil May Cry. The difference between these games and Furi, of course, is that the entire game of Furi is just these boss encounters. This is middle management the game. There are no proles, there are no regular employees working in the world of Furi, it's just bosses. Bosses make the coffee, bosses do all the menial tasks, and bosses also kick the crap out of you. And that will present an issue for some. There's no chance to hone your skills on lesser enemies here, you're just thrown straight into the fire. And the only relief is interminable and unskippable walks between the fights. And they're filled with kind of exasperating anime tier dialogue. And I know anime can have good dialogue, but this isn't good anime dialogue. I would have kind of preferred if every stroll between the fights was just soundtracked by the game's kind of interesting music. But the game bakers are clearly riffing very heavily on Afro Samurai's kind of aesthetic here, and I guess this was always the way it was going to be. And the one saving grace is that you can change the dialogue from English to French to Japanese, so you can get away from the clunky translation if you so choose. These protracted walking sections aside, Furi is a lean and intense experience. Every fight had my hands aching and shaking, whether I won them or I lost them, and believe me, I lost a bunch of them because you have to keep replaying these fights to get anywhere. And the mechanics are solid enough that there's little room for blaming the game when you fuck up. Bearing in mind you will fuck up an awful lot, so it's nice that you can't portion the blame away from your slow, rubbish human hands. Keeping in theme with its tug-of-war health bar system, Furi also has a parry which is heralded by a big flash of light and a big piercing sound that allows you to regain health, which lets you gamble then for a regen in longer stretches of the fights. You can either choose to rush to the finale knowing you might die during that finale, or you can hang around and risk trying to get some more parries so that you're better equipped for that final little combat phase before you transition. Alongside your regular attacks, you also have the ability to charge your attacks. You can charge your regular slash and you can charge your laser. Unleashing either of those attacks at the right time will do massive damage to your opponent and also put them into a kind of knockdown state so you can get a little bit of a breather. However, it isn't all roses because enemies will frequently dodge your charged shots, and the charged melee attacks have to be delivered at exactly the right time to deal extra damage to the enemy. This means that the game is an exercise in learning these incredibly specific timings, but if you do take the time and persevere to learn when to use these attacks, you can absolutely fly through the fights, and it gives the bosses in Furi a lot of depth, because you can keep coming back to them and keep learning the different timings. And what's really nice about all of these mechanics is that they work together, they tangle together to create a kind of risk-reward system that has just this little sprinkling, this little frisson of depth to it, that a game like this really needs to elevate it above just being a brutal slog through multiple difficult enemies. And if you take all of these ideas alongside the twin-stick shooting that allows you to keep constant pressure on your enemies, the game really brings to mind the primary antagonist fights on big fighting games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta. And it shows that Furi isn't just a gimmick game, it's a game that can be mastered if you give it enough time and attention. And if you're really sadistic and you think that it's not quite hard enough after the first run through, then there is a higher difficulty which mixes up all the attack patterns, which is a really welcome addition. I'm not a big fan of games artificially boosting their difficulty just by giving things more health or making you die quicker, so actually having them change up how they fight is really, really nice. So the combat, which is a mix of ranged attack, really lightning fast flurries of attacks, is reminiscent obviously of Devil May Cry, Bloodborne and Bayonetta with its in-your-face spasms of violence coupled with slight windows for damage bonuses, and thus is a great depth to its violent ballet, which on the surface can appear a little shallow, I'll give you that. And it's definitely worth saying that I don't think any of this would really matter if the bosses were little more than an escalating series of challenges of a similar type, but luckily each encounter ends up managing to feel quite unique beyond their vivid colour palettes. They all do rely on your knowledge of the core skills, but each boss takes one of those core skills and really forces you to think about how you can apply it in various different situations. The first boss is just a tutorial and therefore it throws everything at you, whereas later bosses tend to divvy up their attention between close or long range encounters, with arenas and attack effects that are mixed up enough to call to mind the rogue galleries of the Metal Gear Solid games. As a big fan of those games, it really does feel at times like this game is playing a huge homage to Kojima's cadre of unique one-off challenges. There's a samurai duel and a roaming sniper battle that are both reminiscent of Revolver Ocelot and The End respectively. But what's brilliant is that no boss immediately feels recognisable as an encounter lifted wholesale from another game. For example, the sniper employs stealth, but also a legion of drones that it sends at you that force you to think on your feet. Do you want to hang around and fight these guys with a chance to gain a little bit of health, or do you just want to go straight after the main enemy and get it over with? And as an aside to this, there are a few bosses that initially appear to be uninventive melee characters, but the game twists their formula just enough with things like area denial attacks or the ability to dodge or parry your shots or blows in a way that really makes the game feel more generous with its slight number of encounters than it may initially appear. There's definitely more than one memorable fight in this rogues gallery. One involves a character who can stop time, which means your own bullets freeze and become part of this nightmare maze of projectiles that you have to navigate, and it really forces you to focus on your parry timing to get yourself out of tight corners. Whereas another boss works on a very simple principle that if you just kind of tweak the timing of attacks very slightly to throw the player off, the parry system becomes much harder to manage and the fight becomes much closer and harder to deal with. In the end, it's definitely Furi's innate desire to repeatedly riff on the same mechanics, kind of like jazz, and encourage you to hone your knowledge of a limited skill set that sets it apart from other boss fights. The battles end up feeling kind of rhythmic and musical. They're almost like scales or poems in the way that they offset their beats, stresses, and meters in a way to feel unique beyond just the style and execution of their character designs. The only issue I think I can legitimately square at Furi outside the languid ambling between fights is that the back and forth can sometimes stall your ability to learn the different stages of the fights. Most fights have a final stage that are a little gimmicky. They're kind of dazzling and deliciously difficult, but they're perhaps a little bit too reliant on trial and error pattern decoding compared to the other stages. There's no denying that these Toho-inspired bullet hell sections are extremely satisfying once you can conquer them, but the inability to earn back health compared to the rest of the fight means that by the time you've mastered the rest of the battle, the last act can still act as a stopping point and can keep robbing you of all your health in one fell swoop over and over and over again. And I'm no stranger to this issue. I spent 4 hours, probably 8 hours now, trying to crack the last couple of stages of this very hard optional boss that you can fight at the end. It's kind of like Ikaruga on acid, but it hasn't stopped me from really enjoying the rest of the game. Those sequences where you can just rely on gut instinct and your reactions, as well as understanding the signalled attacks, are incredibly satisfying. Furi is a furiously stylish and competent game, if you see what I did there, and it knows how to improvise on its pocketed violent chord sequences and its intricate combat melodies in a way that turns its fights into dances to the death, that give you the chance to immerse yourself in combat in a way that other games wouldn't let you do outside of cutscenes. And because of that, I think it really reminds me of going back and playing the bosses in Metal Gear Rising on one of the harder difficulties and trying not to get hit, just for an achievement. And it wasn't because I really liked achievements, it's just because I thought this combat system deserves that amount of attention, and sure enough, I managed to do it. It was very hard, but like Furi, it never felt unfair. And so that's Furi. It's kind of a bizarre mess of rhythm, reactions, muscle memory, and just pure instinct. It's a reminder that games don't need to have dozens of complex and interlocking systems that sprawl over huge maps full of unlockables and collectibles to be engaging. It's a reminder that if you take a couple of select, interesting, and well-developed verbs and string them together in a way that is compelling, even an experience that looks like all surface but no feeling can actually really sing. Just one last thing then. If you enjoyed this video, please click on the link up there to subscribe, leave a comment, like it, maybe even share it with some other people. We don't use ads, we don't ask money, we just want to share this stuff, and if you could help us do that, that would mean the absolute world to us. Thanks, and see you later.